Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Elif and Maya, immensely for giving your time. And we're here to talk about Syria tonight, and the most important thing are the Syrian people. And everybody, please remember there are various charities about Syria. There's Médecins Sans Frontières, there are forms here which does wonderful work in Syria, and there is the White Helmets, specifically a Syrian civil defense group helping victims of conflict in Syria, and there is Syria Relief, which you will find easily on the web to give, which also helps the victims of this terrible, terrible conflict. And we're each going to speak for a few minutes, and then questions are welcome. And I really fell in love with Syria when I first went there in 1969 to the Souk of Aleppo. In fact, most people who go to the Souk of Aleppo fall in love with it. And then I began to write history books, and the history of Syria is so particularly fascinating because it's so many different layers, so diverse, so connected to France, to England, to Iran, to Turkey, above all to the Syrians themselves, who themselves belong to so many different groups and religions. And I began my book on Aleppo with the Ottoman conquest in 1516. Yavuz Selim, which means Selim the Resolute, I think, not Selim the Terrible, conquered it, one of the great movements in world history. In fact, it shaped the history of the Middle East for the next 4 centuries, when most of the Arab-speaking countries came under Ottoman control. And whatever you say about the Ottoman Empire, it had many cruel and oppressive aspects, like all empires. It did have a philosophy of diversity. You can see this in the recruitment of the Janissaries, who were specifically from non-Turks to begin with. Many Ottoman poems praising the virtues of different races. And Suleiman the Magnificent, the son of Yavuz Selim, frequently wintered in Aleppo when he was on campaign. Already there was the conflict between Turkey and Iran, which we see echoes of today with the profound Iranian involvement in supporting the Assad government. Anyway, Turkey was constantly fighting Iran. Suleiman was wintering in Aleppo because it was the most convenient military base near the Iranian frontier. And there was a debate in his council over whether to expel Jews from the province of Aleppo. There had been a very prosperous Jewish community in Aleppo really forever. And the Aleppo Codex is the oldest or best surviving codex of the Torah. It's now in Jerusalem. Anyway, there was this debate. The Sultan asked his advisors to consider a flower pot that held a quantity of fine flowers of diverse colours that was then in the room, and bid them consider whether each of them in their colour did not set out the other the better. The more sorts of nations I have in my dominions under me, as Turks, Arabs, Greeks, etc., the greater authority they bring to my kingdoms, and make them more famous, and that nothing may fall off from my greatness. I think it convenient that all that have been together long hitherto may be kept and tolerated so still for the future. And naturally his council agreed unanimously. And that is really part of the philosophy that governed Aleppo for the next 400 years. There were no one group was exclusively dominant. It was mainly a majority Sunni Muslim city, but there were also Christians and Jews and Shia Muslims and Armenians increasing after the 17th century. Churches could be built against Sharia law, which doesn't encourage the building of new churches. And this very diverse city, which some travellers called an epitome of the whole world. There were so many different nations living there. It flourished, and England already had traders there from the 1580s. It was already a global economy. They were trading in textiles and silk and raisins and many other commodities. And English travellers said it was an epitome of the whole world. Caravans used to come from India, from the Caucasus, from Istanbul, from the Gulf, from Iran. The silk trade from Iran was particularly important. That is why it became an Armenian city, because Armenians helped run the silk trade. And these caravans would come in, thousands of camels at one time, and they helped make the city prosperous. And there are wonderful travel books about Aleppo. There's a recently discovered portrait by Andrea Soldi of the Gentleman of Aleppo is in the Vice Gallery behind us in Jermyn Street. And one day I hope there will be an exhibition of these portraits and panoramas of Aleppo in the 17th and 18th centuries. And there was a relative, I know this sounds like a dream, but this is what travellers who were there at the time wrote. They say there's a perfect tolerance of religion. The explorer John Lewis Burckhardt, who was there to learn Arabic, wrote, "It is necessary to have lived for some time among the Arabs and to have experienced the mildness and peacefulness of their character and the sobriety and regularity of their habits to conceive it possible that the inhabitants of a town like Aleppo should continue to live for years without any legal master or administration of justice." That's at a time when there were rebellions against the Ottoman Empire, protected only by a miserable guard of police, and yet the town should be a safe and quiet residence. John Barker, an English consul, wrote, "Men of different creeds live in perfect peace and not infrequently in relations of the closest friendly intercourse." And the same would apply to women who would meet each other in hammams and in the souk also. And trade was the basis of this city and this coexistence, I think. And there are various proverbs about trade from Aleppo. If you do business with a dog, kindly call him sir. If you have money, then you can marry the daughter of the Sultan, and so on. There were these wonderful khans were built, which survived until yesterday. Maybe some of them survive, like the Khan al-Gumruk, which housed the French, Dutch, and English consuls and contained at one time 344 shops. And the Chevalier d'Avier, a French consul, wrote, "What is good and extraordinary and which advantageously distinguishes this people," he's talking about Aleppo, "is that they are the gentlest, the least malicious, and the most tractable of all the vast Ottoman Empire." And this coexistence survived more or less unchanged until 1914. It survived even the introduction of industrialization, the growing prosperity of Christians. There was one massacre when a few people died in 1850, and after that, relative peace. And Lawrence of Arabia talks about this relative peace in Aleppo compared to greater extremism in other cities that he had visited. He was often there in 1912 to 14 when he was helping an archaeological dig on the banks of the Euphrates. And 1914 to 18, the horrors of the Armenian massacres in Anatolia, but many Armenian refugees come to Aleppo and are welcomed and survive and flourish there. There is the famous Baron Hotel run by Armenians, the hospital of the Altunian family, Mustafa Kemal. In October 1918, the Ottoman general, an Ottoman general is actually living in the Altunian hospital because he was ill at the time. And in fact, some of the last conflicts of the First World War in the Middle East took place in the streets of Aleppo and outside Aleppo. And Kemal had to shoot his way through the streets at the end of October 1918. Then there is a very tense situation between the Syrians, led by the Emir Faisal, the leader of the Arab revolt, and he comes to Aleppo and repeats this message: Muslims, Christians and Jews are all Arabs. They are all united by being Arabs. Anybody who tries to divide them is not a true Arab. And this was the message of Syria and Aleppo then. He was thrown out by the French army in 1920. The French mandate lasted until 1946. It was ended in part due to British pressure on de Gaulle and the Free French, as well as rising Syrian nationalism. And the Syrian society survives even the ordeal of foreign rule, which pulverizes many other societies. There was no reprisals against Christians or French supporters of French rule after 1946, a really astonishing achievement when you consider other countries where there were reprisals. And 1946 to the 1950s, there are many coups d'etat in Syria, but somehow the society survives, education is advancing. The Aleppo University was founded. In my book there are many photographs of Nadi Halep, the famous club where people from different communities enjoyed themselves. And it's after 1970 and the seizure of power by Hafiz al-Assad that things begin to change. It no doubt had some good intentions and reformist intentions, and tried to do something for education and for dividing land among the poor laborers on the land, but it was a very strong and oppressive dictatorship. There were many risings. You could read about it in the novel In Praise of Hatred by Khalid Khalifa, in many other novels by Syrians. And inevitably, after 40 years of dictatorship and increasing dynasticism, it's a dynastic rule. The real constitution of the country is in part the relationships of the Assad family and their friends and supporters. And the succession of Bashar al-Assad, inevitably there was an explosion, and this is also linked to the impoverishment of the countryside, climate change, desertification. What happened in Syria could happen in many other countries. Increasing poverty, resentment of the riches of the cities of Damascus and Aleppo and other cities that finally exploded in 2011 and 2012, and possibly the sectarian nature of the regime, and possibly the repressive means used right from the start by the Assad government and the army helped fuel the fight against it, which is going on to this day. As we speak, there is fighting outside Aleppo. The rebel-held areas are being cut off by government troops. There is growing Russian and Iranian involvement, as there has been foreign support for the Syrians against Assad from Gulf regimes and indeed from the Turkish government. The whole key, in a way, to the Syrian situation are the policies of Erdogan. At first a supporter of Assad, then violently opposed to Assad, and now trying to make friends with Assad again. So as it began from 1516, it was already a world economy, and Aleppo and Damascus were world cities on major trade and pilgrimage routes. So it has continued. Syria is part of the world, and we must try and help Syrian refugees and charities as much as possible. And in fact, there was a Guardian article a few months ago saying the fate of Europe depended on the fate of Aleppo, meaning the refugee problem of Syria has affected votes and decisions about and inside Europe. And now I have given a brief historical outline, and Maya Chehade, who is a student in conflict resolution at King's College, London, and herself from Aleppo, is going to speak to us a bit about the situation in Syria now.
Thank you, Phillips. I'm going to talk about Aleppo. I grew up in Aleppo, and what I would like to say is that my city shows that the Syrian conflict is not only sectarian conflict. Indeed, I grew up with friends and best friends and families celebrating Eid and Easter and many other celebrations. We used to live together and coexist, and we used to... I think one of the things that characterizes the most the city is not any sectarian division. And unlike what the media and a lot of politicians say, Aleppo shows that the Syrian conflict is not based on sectarian hatred, and the actual urban planning of the city shows this. In fact, as Latakia is an example of sectarian division between the Alawis and the Sunnis, for example, Aleppo is not at all an example of this. It is a city that is indeed divided, but it is divided on socioeconomic terms and on class divisions. And I would like to talk more about this today, because I think this is very important to understand in order to understand the Syrian conflict and in order to try to grasp what type of solutions we should try to look for. The socioeconomic divisions that started in Aleppo go back to the history, and as Philip rightfully explained, many civilizations came to my home city. In fact, Byzantines, Romans, Seljuks, and the Ottoman Empire, and what is now considered the Syrians and whatever we are today. And the city was a hub for trade, commerce, and diplomatic agreements. And this resulted in, after the consolidation of the Syrian state and its establishment under the Assad regime afterwards, it generated to an economic importance that we inherited of history. And in fact, Aleppo produced before the conflict more than 2/3 of the Syrian GDP. All of this economic importance, unfortunately, wasn't coupled with the development, and massive urbanization created a lot of tensions, especially in certain neighborhoods that are concentrated in the east of the city. This generated a lot of inequalities, which the government wasn't able to tackle, and in fact, no social justice generated to a heated mobilization during the uprising in 2011. The reason why I'm explaining this is because the uprising in 2011 didn't come from anything. It came from social injustices in certain neighborhoods where people were living in informal settlements who never had any formal or legal agreements from legal documents that actually helped them to have a legal house, or be able to go and work after being able to study in the public university, which was open to everyone. As a result of this uprising, of course, that was the beginning of the division, a clear division of Aleppians. The high and middle class in the west, the northwest, and the lower class in the east. And automatically, those who were more privileged didn't want to actually sacrifice their privileges, and this is why they held a little bit more to the regime, whereas in the east and more in the informal settlements areas or the lower class areas, it was easier for them to mobilize with what they called the Syrian Revolution and the uprising. We all know what happened after the violent and military repression of the Syrian government automatically created two spaces in my home city. a space that is now called the regime-held area and a space that is called the rebel-held area. I think we must be, although I am using the term space and different spaces, we must pay attention to not categorize automatically, because the people who live under these areas are not necessarily represented by the forces that actually fight under their name. Although rebels attack regime-held areas, and regime-held areas attack rebel-held areas and bakeries and hospitals, which is clearly an intentional destruction of space, which we could actually think of a creation of a maybe civic identity which is pro-regime versus against regime. I don't know, this has to be more studied. I think it is important to note, and this is from my personal experience and from my contacts who still live and my family who still lives in Aleppo, there's a silent majority, what we call the silent majority, that hasn't been heard. And we think that most of Aleppians, if they're in the east, they're pro-rebels, or if they're in the west, they're pro-regime, but this is not necessarily true. It's only the people who hold arms who get to have a saying in this conflict. And I would like to conclude by saying that we Syrians and Aleppians in general, we didn't know of each other until this uprising and this conflict took place. We barely heard about Banyas and Dera. We barely heard about other neighborhoods. I barely went to some neighborhoods and informal settlements because they were lower class and because my parents wouldn't let me go there. And I think one of the positive things, and I think we have to think positively, is that we are creating and imagining a community that hasn't been maybe thought about before or hadn't, and now we are actually creating a state, hopefully.
Thank you very much, Maya, and there'll be plenty of time for questions later. I'm sure we all have a lot of questions for Maya, and it reminds me of 1975 to 90, East Beirut and West Beirut, and the film West Beirut, and the divisions. And to a certain extent, the Civil War helped create a Lebanon, but a very divided one, I think. Now, Elif, please talk to us this evening with all your experience.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so wonderful and at the same time so sad to listen to your powerful talks. I thought I could draw it to perhaps a more international context, because what we call the Syrian conflict today is not only determined by the Syrian people or by the forces, the clashes within Syria, but it has become an international conflict. And there are so many actors, international actors, that are involved in that conflict, including my own motherland, Turkey. So many visible and invisible forces being involved, and also vice versa. What's happening in Syria is affecting the destinies and the future of many people in other parts of the world. So we are all in this together. And I really want to emphasize this. We are so much interconnected today. As you pointed out, what's happening in Aleppo affects the results of referendums in Europe, affects what people think about EU or the future of EU, and also perhaps affects a certain tide of xenophobia, the rise of ideologies that we thought we had left in the past. And I want to talk a little bit about the past, because particularly in the region where we come from, the past is not bygone, the past is not left behind. The past is in fact very much alive. But I don't want to generalize it too much. I believe in particular the 19th century is not over yet. So many problems that we've begun seeing, particularly in the 19th century, are coming back, resurfacing today because they were not settled. What we have done was just to try to proceed with a collective amnesia, ruptures, without really coming to terms with the atrocities of the past, with the problems, troubles of the past, and trying to move on with a makeup and modernize as fast as we could. And of course, underneath, there were boiling clashes, there were boiling conflicts. What you said is so beautiful. You said we didn't know each other. It's true, not only within Aleppo, but within the Middle East. People sometimes think because this is a mostly overwhelmingly a Muslim region, everybody would understand each other. That is not the case at all. There are 3 million, officially 3 million, probably more, refugees in Turkey. And right now we are seeing lots of cultural clashes, social clashes. Class is a big, big factor in this. It makes a huge difference whether you have the means to move on to another country, whether you have a passport, a citizenship, other options. And the people who suffer are the ones who have the least means. There are lots of stories. I'm very interested in stories as a novelist, as a storyteller, but I'm also interested in the silences, the things we don't talk about. And I believe women and children, especially, we do not talk about their stories. In Turkey, along the southeast border, I'm very interested and try to get the best information I can from women's organizations that are locally working in those areas. And all of them are saying this is alarming. There's a lot of sexual harassment. We see an alarming increase in the number of child brides, but also a large number of Turkish men right now getting married to Syrian girls as their second wives, third wives, even though polygamy is illegal on the surface. So underneath this very already sad framework, there are lots of layers that we fail to talk about. The way I see it, the refugee problem, as we call it, is the biggest humanitarian crisis ever since the Second World War. It's an international crisis, and it can only be solved internationally if we cooperate together, if we understand that we're all in this together. By trying to outsource the problem, by trying to build walls, and thinking that if they're geographically away from us, the problem will be away from us, that's an illusion. That's an illusion. It will only postpone the problem maybe for another year, for another 2 years, but the clashes are inevitable because we're all interconnected. My own personal journey with Syria started when I was in high school. My mother lived, I was raised by a single mother. My mother lived in Jordan at the time, and each time we would travel, my mother and I, by car through Syria and spend especially try to spend more time in Aleppo, which I loved, and I loved the soup and the people. But I was also aware that coming from Turkey, how little I knew about the Middle East in general, and Syria in particular. This is quite ironic because the geographical proximity is so obvious, and yet culturally the gaps were so sharp. We had a similar history together, but our interpretations of that history were completely different. We grew up with a nationalistic interpretation of history that always told us that the Arabs had backstabbed us, they had stabbed us in the back. We never thought that through the eyes of a Serbian citizen, of a Bulgarian citizen, of a Syrian citizen, the same Ottoman history could be read and reread in a completely different way. It never occurred to us. Over time, as I began publishing, I realized how little connections there were also between our literary circles. In Turkey, writers from the Arabic language have been translated into Turkish language only recently, and so few of them. I mean, Necip Mahfuz from Egypt, we started reading him only recently. Adonis maybe is an exception, of course, but very few exceptions. Other than that, we don't read each other's stories. We don't know much about each other. So I became troubled by all those gaps. But to me, I think we need to pay much more attention to the silenced within this huge conflict, starting with women, starting with minorities, but also including sexual minorities. I cannot understand how, even though it has been in the making, I mean, the Syrian problem, as we call it today, didn't happen overnight. It took years and years It was coming. All the signs were there, political, social, and economic signs were there. And yet Europe is caught unguarded, completely by surprise. When we look at the refugees who could come to Europe, most of them, because the journey is so dangerous, because the journey is full of so many obstacles, most of the people who could make it to Europe, to continental Europe, are young men between the age 25 and 40, not less than 40. Now, women, older people, children, they cannot make this journey. Very few of them can make it. This might seem like an unimportant detail, but it has proven to be incredibly important. We've seen in Cologne, we have seen in Sweden, it even affected the gender ratio. I cannot understand how and why we're not supporting more the sexual minorities coming from Syria, women coming from Syria, and why this whole conflict is in such a huge mess at the moment. 3 countries have the biggest number of refugees. Of course, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Turkey. If you travel across Turkey, you will see most of the refugees are not in refugee camps. Less than 8% of the refugees are in refugee camps, and all the rest are in towns and cities in Turkey, many of them in towns that have warmer climates, so that they can sleep in parks, they can sleep on the streets. This is also creating more clashes. The Turkish government at the moment, just yesterday, was talking about giving them citizenship, but again, this is something that can cause lots of problems, because now many Turks are saying so that the government can buy their votes. So within the society, it's creating more and more fractures. In towns, we are seeing an increase in xenophobia. It is admirable, I think, that Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan have taken a very large number of refugees, but without proper planning. Nobody was expecting this conflict to go on for so long. And in the meantime, we have the rich Gulf states, almost nothing, as if they have nothing to do with this conflict, washing their hands off. So I think we need to think about Syria as world citizens, primarily, and to understand that we're all in this together, we're all in this and connected. Our stories are connected, but also I believe our destinies and our happiness is very much connected.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you very, very much, Elif. And when the Palestinian refugee problem started in 1948, there was a United Nations body specifically created to look after them, which still survives, UNHR, I think. And there has been no United Nations body for the Syrian refugees. And of course, one cause for the horrible intensification of the conflict has been ISIL in eastern Syria, and one cause for the creation of ISIL has been the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003. Many things go back to that, though by no means all. Now, I'm sure there are some questions from the room. Has anybody got any questions? Yes, over there.
Yeah, question for Maya. You're saying there that the initial conflict in Aleppo was very much on class lines in the sense of the haves and the have-nots. I'm just interested to know, in terms of religious divisions, would you find more Alawis, for example, amongst the haves, or Sunnis amongst the have-nots?
Well, thank you for your question. It's not, Alawis are not a majority in Aleppo. It's more Christians, Armenians, and Kurds. First, I'm going to lay out how the city is organized in terms of different minorities, if you want to call them like that. So basically, the ethnicities or religions, religious communities in Aleppo are not, let's say, situated all in one section of the city. And this is where the city, the urban planning of the city is really interesting. It's circles of different neighborhoods of religious communities in different areas that are spread all throughout the city. And this is part of the reason why we can't qualify the conflict in Aleppo as a sectarian one. Now, in terms of answering your question, yes, they are. They are the most privileged, and when I'm saying yes, I'm referring to the religion, to the Christian minority. This is because it has been part of the Assad government's strategy of co-opting always the minorities into his side, because he is part of a minority himself, the Alawis. Now, now we talked about the Christians. Unfortunately, it wasn't the case for the Kurdish people in Aleppo. They were the circles that were more in the east, and they were the unprivileged, because the Kurdish people in Syria were considered as secondary citizens, and they didn't even have sometimes passport, or they didn't have rights to go to universities or have or take some official jobs or public job sector. So it's a yes and a no question. It depends which minority. Some people tend to say consider the Christians more as the minority in Syria because they're Christian, whereas the Kurdish are Sunnis. But I would say that both are equal. Equal minorities, yeah.
And then just a follow-up question. From what you described, is that likely to make some sort of resolution in the future, coming together of those communities, that much more difficult?
The minorities?
Well, yes, or the different, different sects that you've described, given that, to an extent, if you've indicated you've got the Christians as the haves, the Kurds as the have-nots, given what's happened, is that going to sort of, in terms of the future, is that going to make it more difficult, do you think, for them to sort of come together as one people again?
I don't see this as a problem. I don't see it from a sectarian perspective. The problem, I see it more from a haves and a haves-not perspective, because, we have the haves-not and we have the haves. But one thing and that's why I said in the introduction, the Syrian conflict is not only a sectarian conflict. It has, of course, a sectarian aspect. And one of the biggest proofs is the Kurdish, who are trying to actually establish their own state. So yes, it is complicated, and it's getting more and more complex with actually the support to the Kurdish people who are going, if they were to form a state for themselves, then what is the legitimacy of the Christians of forming their own state and the Sunnis their own states? So yes, it makes it more complex, but I don't see it from a sectarian perspective, or not only.
Can I make a small addition? I think what makes it much more difficult is the fact that power was concentrated for so long in the hands of very few, and the culture of coexistence never developed. This is not only happening in Syria, it's also a danger for Turkey and other parts of the Middle East. And when you have that, when you divide and rule, when you privilege certain minorities so that you can use them against certain other minorities, what you do is to build up resentment upon resentment upon resentment for decades, and then the clashes are inevitable. So I think we need to come back to democracy inevitably. If there were proper democracies in the Middle East, none of this would have happened in this way. And to me, it's a very crucial question, because we get this question a lot, especially as a woman. I get this question a lot. I hear from women readers saying, yes, but we need strong authoritarian leaders who can support us, who can, protect our rights against Islamists. I understand their concern, but that tendency towards strong authoritarian, non-democratic dictators, leaders, is very dangerous, because the only thing it does is to build up resentment, which eventually erupts into civil wars or the breakup of the entire system.
More questions?
You referred to unsettled problems from the 19th century. What are they? What kind of problems arose in the 19th century and then were not resolved?
Yeah, I think the first factor is nationalism. I mean, it's very much alive. And when I look at the writings of intellectuals in 1950s, 60s, very bright people among them, political theorists, it's amazing to see so many of them expected nationalism to disappear from the surface of the earth in the coming decades, especially after globalization. But that didn't happen in the way they predicted. In fact, today I think we need to talk about nationalism very seriously, and of course ultranationalism. It is the way I see it, a big danger, very contagious, very toxic and divisive. Of course, religious fundamentalism, equally, in my opinion, dangerous. But again, it comes back to the same problem. What didn't develop in the Middle East was a supranational identity, like an umbrella identity that could embrace people together. The Ottoman Empire, you're right, I mean, I am critical of many things that happened in the Ottoman Empire, starting with the Armenian genocide, of course, but also it had lots of beauties that we must highlight. And there was a desire or a wish, sometimes for pragmatic reasons, for practical reasons, for coexistence. That didn't develop. Identities that go beyond tribes. Today, what we're seeing is we're coming back to tribalism. And because the boundaries were not legitimate, according to many people, the boundaries drawn, and we need to talk about colonialism as well. Now people are talking about changing those boundaries, and they're talking about bloodshed,
Imposed boundaries after 1918 that didn't really fit. I mean, even the eastern bit of Syria, the northeast bit, is geographically more linked to Iraq. It's on the Euphrates, and the creation of Lebanon, and also the failure to make a prosperous agriculture, which is one reason why so many people came to the towns, and the failure to, and the appalling popularity of emigration, so that talent leaves the country generation after generation, which started in the 19th century with Syrians and Lebanese going all over the world, to Latin America as well as Western Europe and America.
Because most of the problems you're referring sounds to me more like 20th century, mid-20th century problems. The colonialism issue arose, at least in Syria, after World War I. I believe it was an independent war under the Ottoman Empire before. And the religious fundamentalism, I think, was started after the 1940s. Because I remember reading a couple of books on, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood, and that started only in the 20th century. So I was wondering, what is specific from the 19th century in terms of continuing throughout the 20th century?
Well, of course, it's mostly late 19th, early 20th century. But for instance, in the Ottoman case, nationalism was a very destructive force because this was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious empire. And once national identities became the main identity politics for the minorities, one by one, they saw Bulgarian nationalism, Serbian nationalism, Greek nationalism, Turkish nationalism, each followed the other one. And there was an attempt for a while to cultivate an Ottomanism that would bring more people together, and it didn't work. I think religion, they started using religion, people like Sultan Hamid, they started using religion early on. And afterwards as well, when the Ottomans sided with Germany, for instance, in the First World War, there were rumors that Bismarck was in fact a secret Muslim, that he was born a Muslim, that the Quran was whispered into his ear, and in fact he was a Haji. And all of these rumors were, of course, deliberately propagated so that the Ottomans could side with Germans. So you see, religion was used as an instrument.
But there was already, in the 19th century, problems between some Arabs and Turks were already beginning, and Kurdish desires for even a state, because there were Kurdish threats on Aleppo before 1914 even. And But Ottomanism did work for some people, particularly perhaps for the city of Aleppo, and some people in Damascus. They did go and study and settle in Istanbul, and there were many marriages between families up to the 1970s, I think, and people going from Turkey to shop in Aleppo. The whole issue of boundaries is now up in the air. Iraq is clearly becoming 3 different regions and probably states. Possibly the same thing will happen in Syria. More questions? I have a question for Maya about Latakia. You were saying that it's quite a sectarian city, the great port on the coast. It's in what way? Where do the different communities live? Are they all separated one from the other?
Yes, they are. So basically, remember how I was explaining the circles of different religious communities in Aleppo and how they were spread all throughout the city.
Yes.
This is not the case in Latakia. And actually, Fabrice Balanche made a very good study about it where he actually explained the nature of Latakia, which is much more sectarian, where the Sunnis and the Alawis were separated from the east and the west, whereas Damascus is another model, which I think Aleppo follows, where you have a much more mixity in the urban planning and urban development of the city.
I remember going to a conference in Damascus in about 2005, and a lady there said that when her Syrian husband came on holiday to France and he saw a demonstration in the streets, he wept because he'd never seen a demonstration in his entire life. So great had been the repression in the country. Yes, over there.
Hello. I'm actually from the pub shop, which I said full disclosure. I haven't worked with Philip directly because I work with politics. Thank you for bringing together the past and the present so wonderfully. It's rare that happens. That was true then. I was wondering from each of your perspectives what the future holds. How do you think we can resolve this seemingly enormous?
Well, there must be change. I mean, you can't have the same family ruling a country since 1970. There must be, nothing will be resolved unless there's change at the top. And it's complete rigidity by Assad and his group, although there's also rigidity on the other side, of course. I think there should be a United Nations army, if such a thing can be created, at least for several years, in key areas in Syria, to give people confidence to return to their homes. Otherwise, they never will. So an entire country has been, not an entire country, but sections of an entire country have been emptied because of this conflict. And hatreds have been sown, in some cases, as you were saying, deliberately, between communities, which will make it much more difficult to recreate the very strong, varied Syrian society that existed before. And the involvement of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, I mean, they're practicing weapons and war techniques they didn't have before. Why would they want to stop that?
So that's the historian's perspective. And what do you think coming from that? Where do you see it?
Well, as a Syrian and as an Aleppian, my first answer to your question is let Syrians decide what is going to happen in Syria, and not Russia, not Iran, not Gulf countries, not the US, not Turkey, not France, not Great Britain, not all of these involvements. And I would like to point out, this is an opportunity for me to say that ISIS fighters, a lot of them are not Syrians even, and we are the first victims of them. So this is something that, I mean, we are the first victims of this conflict, and there was an idea and there was a project behind all of this uprising, and people were doing it in a very, I don't want to say civilized way because I hate this word. It comes from the West. In a very organized way, and there was some planning, and the local coordination council did some very good work. Just let them continue their project and decide of what they want to do without any interference.
For me, I think two things are very crucial. The free flow of information, knowledge, to know what's happening elsewhere is incredibly important. And that's why we should read, we should write, we should discuss, we should encourage more books, like Philip's wonderful book, but also political analysis of what's happening right now in different parts of the Middle East, especially in Syria. So the free flow of information, but also stories, individual stories. Because what extremism is doing, extremisms elsewhere, they dehumanize the other. And only stories can rehumanize. If we can't rehumanize, it will be easier to generalize and think that it's someone else's problem. I have nothing to do with it. That is incredibly dangerous. And the way I see it, we are becoming more and more divided into tribes of us versus them. And that is making everything worse. So we need to encourage the free flow of stories and information. I want to think about Levant. You are one of the leading scholars of Levant. What was it? What we have lost? That culture of coexistence, that culture of multiculturalism. Our food, our songs, our tales, our jokes, our sense of humor, black humor, sexual jokes, so many things. The joy of life is being lost, erased right now. We need to bring them back. These other interpretations of Islam, much more liberal, open-minded, embracing. We need multiplicity of voices. The other is very dangerous when we're each reduced down to a single identity, and if we hear only one narrative about the other, I am very worried about the increase of that tendency. So we have to try to break that as best as we can. Nothing can be achieved without a robust civil society. And the civil society can never be robust without the role of women, without the role of different subcultures. And we need to act as world citizens. That's the only way forward that I can see. Otherwise, when I look at politics, politicians, the war industry, weapons, it's very pessimistic. And if we're realistic, we will be pessimistic. But if we look at the people, concentrate on the people, because they're amazing people with incredible resilience, then we also have room for optimism.
And you're completely right about the Levant, and even someone like Mustafa Kemal, who made this nationalistic society with these dreadful history textbooks saying the Arabs stabbed us in the back. He was, of course, himself very international. He'd grown up in Salonika, which was Spanish-speaking. He also knew French. In Aleppo, he had Arab friends, and it was a great effort on himself to make himself a nationalist, though you can see in photographs of him that he wasn't, that his body was always fighting back because his clothes are very, very Western, really quite strange sometimes. And yes, more questions. Yes.
I wanted to sort of follow on that question and ask more specifically about the built environment. I know, I think Marwa al-Sabuni, she's written this amazing book, The Battle for Home, about she's an architect for Palms, about how the recent construction in the sort of latter part of the 20th century has affected the divide in economies. I just wondered if you might be able to talk about in the future how to think about reconstructing some of these places that also
Yeah, thank you for mentioning her book, because I use it in my analysis of Aleppo and of Syria in general. And I think it's a very rich record of evidence of what is actually, why did things happen, why was this uprising, how was it triggered in Homs, because she writes about Homs, and I hope that there's a book like that on Aleppo. About the future, I think, and now I'm gonna go step back and go to another regional area, which is Beirut, because this is a good example of reconstruction after civil conflict. One of my fears is that the reconstruction of the old souk would be done in a very neoliberal
Yes.
and cold way, a la Dubai, as we say.
Hariri
Yeah, a la Hariri, who actually,
wrecked
yeah.
Beirut.
Yeah, the souk of Beirut and this Dubai model of just reconstructing the whole old souk in a very new way, where we don't see the old heritage anymore just because it suits the neoliberal model of the Gulf money that comes and flows and finances this reconstruction. And I think we do have to think about this, and this is one of my biggest fears coming from Aleppo, because the old souk of Aleppo that everyone talks about is so beautiful because it actually preserves the history and this heritage, the UNESCO heritage that we can see. And that's my contribution to whatever future, I think.
Yes.
What's the role, context, motivation of outside forces in Syria for the Western powers, Saudi Arabia, Iran?
Western powers have been quite passive, above all concerned not to repeat the mistakes of Iraq and not to get involved. Saudi Arabia, whether it's the government or individual Saudi millionaires, have been funding extremist Sunni groups. I think that's certain, and some Gulf states also. Iran has been concerned to support the Assad regime because it sees it, not entirely correctly, as a Shia or pro-Shia regime. And in fact, Iran historically was always trying to get, not always, but sometimes trying to get to the Mediterranean in the 17th century and earlier. And Turkey has been changing all the time, and to do with the politics of President Erdogan. He used to declare eternal friendship with Syria and receive Mr. and Mrs. Assad in Ankara, and then he switched, and he has helped to destabilize Syria by aiding armed groups, and then as a result he has welcomed the refugees whom he has helped to create. And whether there is a Machiavellian policy in this to get voters who will vote for him, to whom he is about to give citizenship now, and they will vote for his regime as Turks become increasingly dissatisfied, that is what many writers think. And Russia sees the Assad family as its loyal friends who must be supported, and there is also a Russian naval base in Tartus, the beautiful Crusader city on the coast of Syria.
And to add to that complexity, we need to talk about the Kurds.
The
Kurds are divided. There's a Kurdish population in Syria, in Iran, in Iraq, and of course in Turkey, 4 different countries. And of course there's a movement for independence among different Kurdish groups. So it's an incredibly complicated picture. Ethnic divisions, religious divisions, class divisions, and historical resentments. On top of that, the international involvement.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was late on at the beginning, but I wanted to ask, you were talking about building a new state, and it just feels like statehood is part of the problem. And I know tribalism is part of the problem too, but I'm thinking particularly of, is the nation state an antidote to tribalism or hostile tribalism? I'm not sure it is. We have a problem with the nation state in this country, as evidenced by what happened 2 weeks ago. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about the women in Rojava and the autonomous, or the women in the militias who self-organise their militias, and they seem to be like doing amazing things in that region.
Which women
In
particular?
Rojava, whatever. I can't
Rojava,
pronounce Rojava,
yeah,
sorry.
I understand. Well, of course, within the Kurdish forces, women have played a very, very active role, you know, and they are supported by America against ISIS. Nobody quite knows how many ISIS sympathizers there are, for instance, in Turkey, in the region. Obviously, one of their very clear aims is to deny women their rights. So the women on the Kurdish side, but also in Turkey too, they have been much more emancipated, much more on the forefront and actively involved in this fight. But again, it boils down to the lack of information, the lack of free circulation of knowledge. We really know very little about what is happening. Most of our information is filtered. Even within Turkey, we don't know what's happening in certain southeastern towns, cities, again because the information is very filtered. Now about tribalism, I also see nationalism as a manifestation of tribalism. So for me, tribalism is not only being attached to a tribe, you're right, but nationalism is also a very crude form of tribalism because it's an imaginary community of us versus them, you know, and therefore you're right. Is the nation state the solution to this problem? No, it's not. I think democracy, a pluralistic, liberal, all-embracing democracy will be the solution. The problem is very few people are talking about democracy at the moment. More and more people are saying, in fact, democracy is a luxury for the Muslim Middle East. Look, we have seen the Arab Spring with all the good intentions, but look where it ended up. Maybe it's a luxury. We should invest in stability, not democracy. And I find that a very, very dangerous trend, because in the name of stability, again we go back to dictators, again we go back to concentration of power, which created this problem in the first place. So it's like a vicious circle, again and again, as if we haven't learned nothing from history. So I really believe we need to emphasize the need for pluralistic democracy, and everyone deserves it. And I don't think it's a luxury for the Middle East at all.
Is Rojava not like an example of how it's working well?
You mean democracy?
Well,
or
this kind of more lateral way of
more lateral, more horizontal, yes,
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
But I mean, it's part of a structural explanation. There is a structural explanation to it. The Kurdish forces are being able to stabilize the region, and this is why there's more participation, and there's media who comes in, and we see those women who are women from Rojava. But there are other initiatives, in other places, which Elif was talking about, which we don't have access to because of the conflict. But I do not think that Rojava is the only place where women are active. In fact, there are other places where they're active, maybe not holding arms and weapons, but doing it in another way, such as organizing in the coordination councils until now. And
Thank you.
Now, one last question, or one or two last questions? Yes?
Just picking up on what you were saying then, Elif, and in many ways I think you've highlighted the huge challenge, not just for Syria, but for the rest of the Arab world as well. Given the experience in recent years in Iraq, in Libya, the decisions that the Egyptians made, having gone down the route of selecting a new leader through democratic means, and then quite clearly a huge majority of Egyptians felt that that was not what they wanted, and there was genuine celebration when Sisi came back, and despite the fact it was a return in many ways to what they'd experienced for generations under Mubarak and his predecessors. What confidence, make this as a question, what confidence do Syrians have that if they go down this democratic route, we're not going to find ourselves in the same situations that
like to think of democracy as a path towards adulthood. You have to go through teenage life and teenage experience. And this is where we are trying, or we tried to get to with this uprising, and we failed. Egyptians made an amazing job in actually doing their first revolution. Second one was a coup d'etat, and then it just went down the hill.
So without doubt popular.
It was popular, but it wasn't democratic. I mean, it was the military who took over. As a Syrian, I'm not. A lot of Syrians I know are scared from what you're saying, and which is totally legitimate, because we want to think about the present, or the very close future. We don't want to think about what comes after. I would like to think about my country, what comes after. I think we are going to if we go through a democracy, we're going to fail, because we don't know. We were granted independence in '46. A state was established. Then we had a dozen of years of instability. Then we had a dictatorship for 40 years now. I mean, we have to learn how to actually do or live in a democracy. I mean, look at Europe, look at the West. We are still, there are different phases of democratization, and I do believe in the different phases of democratization. And I think if you don't fail the first time, like a teenager, you're not going to learn how to become an adult eventually. And I think it's part of a learning process that is inevitable and that we will have to go through, otherwise we would be geniuses.
Okay, one last question.
Given the very poor track record of the UN in handling civil conflict, from the Congo crisis in the 1960s to the war and genocide in the 1990s, how do you think they're going to be any different in 2016 in Syria?
No, I don't think they'll be better, but they have prevented wars continuing, for example, in the Sinai Peninsula in the 1950s. I cannot think of any other situation, certainly not any other solution, certainly not a great power solution. How to reduce the level of fear in Syria? How else except through another army? Anyway, thank you both very, very much for speaking so wonderfully, and thank you all for coming. And please, there's more wine, I think, and books.
We need to drink that.
The duty of publishers is to make sure that Syrian voices are heard. I've learned so much from the Syrian novels that have been published in English and French.